back to our podcast for the month of, what is this, September, October?
It is still September, yeah.
But we'll be posting this probably in October.
No, still in
No,
September.
Okay.
In September.
So we do our September podcast, and we have some very interesting review paper to go over with you guys today. It's a annual review that is titled "The Impact of Toxins on the Developing Brain," and it is by an MD named Bruce Lanphier. I don't know if I said that correctly, but we're gonna go with it.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And this is a little bit older. It was published in 2015, so about 5.5 years ago. But I do still feel like
Leah,
10
it's
10 and a half.
2025. I was like, we're not in 2020.
Well, that whole period of time is just gone. It's time.
I know, but we are absolutely in 2025.
Anyway, so 10 and a half years ago, so it is considered older. However, I do still think the information in this review is still relevant to today and today's world and today's health and just in general. I think it's still relevant.
I think it provides a good foundation for what we know now also.
Yes, for sure. So let's just dive in with like an introduction of how the research world even began understanding what toxins are, how we got, the development of toxins and how they were labeled, and when we sort of started correlating them with different health and neurological issues. So do you want to tell us, Mart, a little bit about the history of when the recognition of the toxin impact kind of started?
Yeah. So this happened on multiple occasions, and it started out in the early 1900s. So that's a century, 2 centuries ago. Not yet 2 centuries, but feels like it. Feels like it. It was in Queensland, Australia, and what happened was there was lead poisoning from paint caused anemia, paralysis, blindness, and death in children. So that was one of the first, I guess, cases that sparked that interest. And going 50 years further in, I don't know if I pronounce this correctly, Yamata, Japan in the 1950s, a mercury-contaminated fish led to severe motor dysfunction and intellectual disability in children. It wasn't just one fish, by the way. It was like, multiple fish. But they led to severe motor dysfunction and intellectual disability in children. What was up next?
The thalidomide epidemic also kind of occurred around this same time. And it kind of revealed that placenta was not a barrier to toxins. So the placenta is the tube that connects the fetus to the mother while it is still inside the womb, and it is a source of food and nutrients and blood supply, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, very important and vital for embryonic growth. And so that they recognized around this time point that, the placenta is not a good barrier. It's not preventing these toxins from getting to the embryo or the fetus. And then 5 years later, around 1955, also in Japan, arsenic contaminated milk poisoned, or they correlate that with poisoning 12,000, is that right? 12,000 plus children. And they noticed further from this exposure that the exposed children had 10 times higher rates of intellectual disability of a variety. So then take another 13-ish years or so in the later 1900s, so 1968 in Japan and 1979 in Taiwan, PCB contaminated rice bran oil caused fetal wasting and developmental deficits into dull children. So again, so these are a variety of different toxins that they were able to kind of correlate with different health issues and intellectual disabilities.
What I find interesting, what I notice is that a lot of this comes from Asian countries. And I wonder why that is, if they just saw those patterns there and decided to, what's it called, record it, or did it not happen in more Western countries like the United States or countries in Europe? I wonder, do you know why that might be?
I don't know why a lot of the early research is done in Japan. Like you said, it could just be because they were interested in this.
Yeah,
I do have a kind of like hypothesis. It's like during the early 1900s slash mid 1900s, there was the World Wars, World War II, and then the aftermath of that, and the nuclear happenings in Japan off of that could have sparred or um, gained traction of interest of like how do different toxins in the environment affect um, health. So that could be. I'm not saying it is. I do not know, but going
yeah,
off of historical events, and I'm sure there's way more that I'm not aware of. I'm not a historian, but that those things are big, and it
yeah.
could have sparked interest into understanding toxic material and toxins on health.
That makes sense, though. What we do see, regardless of whether it's in Japan or anywhere else in the world, these events demonstrated that environmental toxins can harm brain development, or at least is correlated to certain um, brain underdevelopments. And over the last century, low level, widespread toxin exposures, damn, that did not come out right. Toxin exposures have been linked to also lower birth weight, preterm birth, intellectual deficits, and mental disorders.
So
Now,
I want
before
to.
we can.
I'm sorry. I want to stop you there. I just want to say the word linked. Linked just means that they are correlated, that they are associated. Does not mean that there is a direct causation yet. So
Yeah,
just keep that in mind as we go through this whole paper.
yep. That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, before we continue, just know that these are correlations. Yeah, it's a common mistake. We even talked about it before we started recording. Is that even the media, especially the media, things like, oh, these are linked, so must mean that one causes the other. Not true. These are correlational, which means there's a relationship, but it doesn't show necessarily a causation. Um, so in individual levels, these effects are often subtle. You might see one person, two people, but then if you look at a whole population, they might look even more significant. It is also so true that the role of toxins in brain based disorders is frequently overlooked or underestimated, according to Mr. Bruce in 2015.
Yeah. And despite us emphasizing that again, the causation factor is not there um, for a lot of these things, it still has an effect. And it is often, more times than not, overlooked by um, doctors or medical care or pretty much anyone. Like, it is more of a functional, holistic view of some of these intellectual disabilities and health issues. But it does, we have seen that they do at least influence these things at quite a significant level, even if they're not direct causation patterns. So that's kind of like the history on how the research world, according to this review article, got started into looking at toxins and their impact on health and brain health. So let's fast forward into some of what is relevant to today's world. And again, these numbers are based in 2015, so these numbers may have changed slightly over the last decade, but again, I still think the relevance to today's society is still there. Over the past century, causes of child death and disability have shifted. Public health efforts early in the 20th century reduced infectious diseases, and they really focused on fighting infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, and really understanding how we can increase life expectancy and decrease these rates of these infections. However, by the late 20th century, um, the coined term new morbidities emerged, and these focused around the more intellectual side. So there was a high emergence in ADHD, autism, asthma, obesity, and preterm birth. So those are like the common childhood deaths that they kind of started seeing emerge instead of these old, not really old, but these more infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, typhoid, and etc.
Yeah, and for people knowing a little bit more about all of the mental health stuff, is tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid are all diseases, while ADHD, autism, asthma, obesity, they are conditions. ADHD and autism are a neurodevelopmental disorder, where obesity is a condition, and asthma is, I don't know if you can outgrow asthma or if you're born with
Can
it. Yeah,
depending upon the type and lifestyle, and same with obesity. So obesity and asthma and those type of things are more lifestyle diseases. They're not infectious diseases. Like giving you a antibiotic is not going to cure
no.
you. In today's world, obesity and asthma do come with medications, but a lot of it is lifestyle driven. A good portion of it.
And neither ADHD or autism can be cured by just a pill or medicine. Like they are neurodevelopmental conditions, which means that you are basically born with it and you're developing with the condition. You can adjust your life according to your struggles, but there's nothing that will take away the ADHD or the autism. It just doesn't exist, and I don't think it will ever exist. Back in 2015, and still now, I think learning disabilities and mental disorders were among the most common childhood conditions. Around 7.6 of the U.S. children have a parent-reported learning disability, and around 13% have a mental disorder, anxiety, autism, cognitive disorder, depression, or ADHD. Developmental disabilities in U.S. children rose 17% from 1997 to 1999 to 2006-2008, adding 1.8 million cases. So you
Yeah, so that's like
see
a
a spike.
17% rise in 10 years.
Yeah, which, we also got to think about how the population was increasing. And when a population increases, more things get noticed. So it makes sense also that it rises, also because I think in that time frame, 1997 to 2008, people were more open to the idea of mental health than they were at the beginning of that period. So I think a couple
What
of
about
things.
concrete diagnosis criteria? Because that also has developed,
It
whereas that
has,
wasn't really a thing. So maybe the
yeah,
diagnosis increased because we have more structure on how to diagnose or what meets the criteria.
that too. We both have more structure on like what are these diagnoses, what do they mean. For example, with the autism, you first still had a difference between Asperger's and autism, whereas they were basically the same thing, just defined by different people. So eventually it became an autism spectrum disorder because they just put it in this one diagnosis. But I feel like there's similar processes with depression, anxiety, the diagnostic treatment criteria change, and they also develop, and the assessments develop, and people are more forward with their problems than they were in 1997. And I think even from 2008 to now, you can see a rise because people have become more forward as well. Looking at autism specifically, the prevalence has dramatically increased even after adjusting for diagnostic factors. So I find that interesting. I personally don't know why that has happened, but a lot of people believe it has to do with prenatal stress. It is also genetic, but I also think that people are more forward when it comes to um, diagnosis like autism.
Yeah. And the CDC reported back at when this article was released, it reported that 823% increase in autism among 8-year-olds just from 2002 to 2010. And parent reported ADHD increased 22% from 2003 into 2007.
But
And
that's parent reported
yes,
ADHD. So that's not actual ADHD
yes.
diagnostics. Okay.
And that was what I was about to say. Like the reliance on parent reported data limits precision.
Yeah.
Anyone in the scientific world will know that there are some pretty severe limitations regarding self reports and parent reports. But these kind of numbers were enough to gain traction that led to more ongoing epidemic kind of evaluation of brain-based disorders.
So all this information that we just told you is taking us to this next part of this research, and that basically talks about why is the developing brain vulnerable. So let's take a dive into that. There's a couple reasons why the developing brain is vulnerable. One of the main reasons is because the blood-brain barrier is immature and more permeable to toxins. So let's translate that to English. If I had to guess, it means that you're in the growing phase and your body is developing, just like how your bones haven't completely grown and you have open spaces in your joint, your limbs. That's why they're all wobbly sometimes. That's kind of the same with the blood-brain barrier. It still has room for development, and it also hasn't fully um, created that firm barrier for the toxins to be able to flush out. I hope I translated that well.
Yeah, I mean
Correct me
it
if I'm
is.
wrong.
No, it is still because the developing brain it's not to its full capacity. When you are young, your immune system isn't fully developed. Things aren't um, as solidified or as complete as they are when you're an adult, and so that just allows things to cross barriers a lot easier, whether good or bad. It allows for that kind of reduced defense because we just don't have we haven't developed that yet. Like when you're born, you're considered like sterile, like you haven't been exposed um, to as much as like an adult. And now
Yeah.
that rapidly changes once you're born, but this is kind of diving into kind of why a fetus, an embryo, a fetus I should say, is I lost my train of thought. Is
That's okay.
That's right.
That's all right. We'll
It
just
is more
go to the
susceptible.
next.
We'll just say is more susceptible to this.
Yeah. We also see that brain growth continues through early childhood. And with brain growth, we mean your actual brain, not your brain development, because that doesn't end until like 25, 26, 27 years old, but your brain growth, which means neural migration, differentiation, and pruning. So your brain is still going through a lot of different phases, including brain cells that are more sensitive to toxins and have longer exposure windows than other organs in that phase, which just makes it more vulnerable to toxins than when you're an adult.
Yeah. And so we talked about the developing brain being vulnerable, but at what points is the brain most vulnerable while it's developing? And the first one is fetal development. Obviously, some of the toxins that have been shown to infiltrate like the fetal barrier is methyl mercury and PCBs. And these have been shown to affect neuron proliferation, migration, and synap- synaptogenesis. So basically, it's just growing, um, and the I don't know how to put this in like easy people terms, but like the growing and development of your neuron, which is like the prime
Yeah.
communication pathway of your brain.
And this is in the fetal development. So when you're still inside the womb, right? Yeah. And then, as we just said, it is also very vulnerable in early childhood. This could lead to exposure, and that disrupts the synaptogenesis, synaptic pruning, and myelination. A lot of different words. It basically just says it disrupts a lot of processes that are important for brain development if you're exposed to these top toxins. However, evidence for timing is limited. Some studies suggest prenatal versus postnatal exposures to PBDEs affect different outcomes, such as attention deficits linked to childhood exposure. So we got to take this with a grain of salt. Maybe nowadays there's more research out there, but back in 2015, the evidence for this timing was limited. Um, Different brain regions may have distinct vulnerability windows for same toxins. So it's possible that your prefrontal cortex has a different vulnerability window than other parts of your brain. But I don't know if that's actually researched or not.
Yeah, they were. I think that's just kind of a suggestion that maybe they were possibly seeing as a pattern, but at this point in time, that was kind of not fully solidified.
Right.
And then some additional factors that increase sensitivity is that the fetal toxin levels may exceed maternal levels, such as in the case of mercury, where actually the fetal toxin levels are excessive or above what the mom or the maternal levels are. Additionally, fetuses and newborns may lack certain enzymes needed to metabolize toxins. An example of that is PON1. That's not really important for if you're just wanting to know this general information, but basically, enzymes are certain proteins in the body that to help metabolize or break down toxins so that they can be expelled or removed from your body. And if they don't have that, then they cannot further get rid of toxins. And then the last kind of factor is that young children often have higher exposures due to metabolism, mouthing behaviors, diet, and faster breathing rates. So they can inhale things more because their breathing rate is faster. Their diets might be different. Mouthing behaviors, they're putting stuff in their mouth all the time. They're exploring, they're chewing. Like that's just part of their
That's
development,
babies.
but that also makes them at a higher risk.
So we've been talking a lot about different toxins, but let's talk about what different toxins actually do to your brain health. So, when we talk about mercury, this could lead to cell death, altered cell migration, and proliferation. Could you explain a bit more what proliferation means again before we go
Yeah,
into
so
the next toxins?
proliferation is basically just reproduction of a cell. So cell um, reproduces in their given way. Some of them, each cell does it kind of differently, but it's just them dividing and making more.
Yeah, so mercury is a toxin that could alter that. Then when we look at lead, this could disrupt neurotransmission, synaptogenesis, synaptic trimming, and myelination. Um, yeah, what is myelination?
Okay, so first we're going to start with synaptogenesis.
Or that.
Genesis is the process of which new connections are formed between neurons in the brain. So think of neurons as like a pigeon. Your brain gives a neuron a message. Big picture, your brain gives a neuron a message and it goes to where it needs to go. So that part of your body gets the message from the brain. Okay. So if
Yes.
you're like a pigeon, you wrap them, your brain will wrap a message and you'll attach it to the pigeon so it can go to wherever it's going. Right.
Yes.
That is basically the neuron is a message carrier. So synaptogenesis is just forming new connections between the neurons and in the brain, um, brain cells.
Yeah.
Going into myelination, that is basically how they travel. So myelination is the process of forming this insulating kind of material around the end of a neuron. So that will allow the messages, because the messages don't pass through the myelin, they actually jump over the myelin. So the myelination, if the myelination isn't formed, the myelin isn't formed through myelination, the messages go slower because they aren't jumping. They're just
Right.
going. I hope that makes sense.
It does. But there's also a lot of information thrown at you guys, so it's okay if you do not fully understand everything. We will, of course, link this paper. So if you want to go ahead and also read it yourself with a little bit more explanation, that is totally fine. Other toxins like DDT, PCBs, PBDEs, and BPA, they disrupt estrogenic and thyroid hormones.
So they're more of the thyroid. They're more the hormonal disruptors.
Yeah. And many toxins can also cause epigenetic changes, such as altered DNA methylation, but it links to neurobehavioral outcomes, but the links to neurobehavioral outcomes are still unclear. So I think that's quite interesting. Um, yeah, I think that's quite
So
interesting.
basically, all that's saying is that toxins have been shown to change your DNA, so your genetics, like your DNA is physically altered, but they haven't quite been able to understand how those changes can affect neuro behavior, basically.
Maybe by this time, 10 years
Yeah,
later,
maybe now,
they've.
but at the point of when this review paper was written. So we've talked a lot about why certain people or ages are vulnerable, how they directly influence the nervous system, hormones, etc. But how do we actually measure doses of toxins inside? Like, how do you know that you have toxins inside of you? So this is done a variety of ways: blood, urine, or tissue samples. So they actually do like tissue biopsies. Um, Early research. So that's what we can do now. However, back prior, before modern kind of data science, early research relied on rough estimates like questionnaires and proximity to pollution resources. So a lot of the early data was based on questionnaires or distance from an actual known toxin exposure. But now we can actually physically measure through blood, urine, and tissue samples what the levels are inside your body.
But even then, there's still challenges that remain with this type of research because it's very difficult to pinpoint exact like windows of vulnerability during development because they're all internal processes, so it's very hard to narrow it down. Like, no, this is the moment when that window is the most vulnerable.
Yeah, and I
You
feel like it's
also,
just hard to like get. I mean, maybe not. I mean, there's a lot of advancements in science. The um, extraction of like tissues or something from a fetus, I feel like it's still kind of a high risk. Maybe not. I don't know. I'm not certain.
I don't know either. It seems dangerous to me. So I feel like it would be easier to do that with early childhood people, kids, than actual fetuses. But I don't know. I'm not a specialist in that field. You also, for these types of studies, need large, long term birth cohort studies to study conditions like ADHD or autism, which, a lot of people always um, decide not to continue with a study like that. So it's really hard to have a big participant pool. And it's also tricky to know if the tissue that we're measuring reflects on what's happening in the brain because we distract some things from blood or urine or different tissue, but how do we know for sure that that's linked to what's also happening within your brain? I think nowadays they have more advanced neuropsychological assessments and also tools to test brain injury or brain activity. So maybe nowadays it's a little bit easier to link the two, but in 2015, those measurements weren't as significant as they are now.
Yeah, and then also kind of like something to consider, at least in the US, is the what is that widespread exposure unfortunately is the norm. So most Americans, including pregnant women and children who we've already identified as kind of an at-risk population, already have detectable levels of metals such as lead, mercury, and arsenic, or persistent pollutants such as PCBs, PBDEs, and DDTs, or even common chemicals such as pesticides. They already have these levels in them at a detectable level. And that's kind of just like the norm. And many of these kind of exposures or toxin exposures are confirmed neurotoxins or hormonal disruptors. Yet most of them haven't been fully tested at this point in time, hadn't been fully tested for their direct effects on the brain. At this point in time, also in 2015, no systematic research on how mixtures of these chemicals that you have inside levels that you have inside your body kind of interact. So we don't, that's a big unknown in 2015.
What is interesting to see though is that certain toxin levels found in people are similar to the therapeutic window for ADHD medications. And this suggests even low exposures can affect brain function. That's just kind of a little side note that we decided to throw in there.
Yeah, and I think it does kind of just show, like, at least in the US, as this paper mentions, that we already have detectable levels. Like, pretty much every person has a detectable level of some sort of toxin in their body.
I feel like
And
it's impossible not to, though.
in today's world, like, yeah, I mean, unless you're living excluded in a non um, kind of Western world, like, I feel like it's really hard to not have some level in you. Like, you're just exposed on a daily basis.
But I feel like even exposure happens just with like nature, like when you're
Yeah,
exposed to
yeah, that's
certain.
what I'm saying. Like, you can't. I don't feel like you can really avoid it really anymore. Um,
No,
and so we do have a few at this point in time, some established toxins that do affect cognition, and these are lead, PCBs, and mercury. And these three specifically are known to have a negative cognitive relationship, where these do cause cognition deficits. Even at low level exposure, for example, lead is an extremely low level is considered negative 10 micrograms per deciliter, which is just a fancy unit, doesn't matter. But even low levels of lead exposure is linked to nearly 7 IQ points lost in children. So there is some direct kind of cognitive deficit seen.
and then looking at some prenatal numbers, prenatal PCB exposure is strongly tied to intellectual deficits, though effects vary by the different types and the tissue measured. And then also prenatal mercury exposure is consistently linked with poorer cognitive outcomes in preschool children. And again, these are correlations. Doesn't mean that these are causes and effects. This just means that someone who is prenatally exposed to mercury has also been shown that their preschool children were showing poorer cognitive outcomes. Could also be a whole different cause of that, but that's just the correlation that was found. There's also been some. Go ahead.
I just want to point out that like it's pretty, as much as it's not a direct cause and effect relation, we do know that these toxins are well established in affecting the cognition. Again, not cause and effect, but it does have some sort of increased risk or some sort of play with those cognitive deficits.
There's also been other toxins with consistent evidence. Now, you might have to help me with the pronunciation, but we have organophosphate pesticides, which prenatal exposure is linked to lower cognitive scores in multiple birth cohorts. Then we have prenatal tobacco exposure, likely reduces cognition, though effects lessen when adjusted for confounders. Now we have airborne pollutants such as PAH and black soot. This is linked to cognitive deficits, outcomes improved after a local power plant closed. And then we have PBDEs. 4 of 5 studies showed lower cognition, significant in 3 studies.
Yeah. And then some tentative evidence. So those with less correlation strength, but still there's a pattern being seen. Prenatal DTT exposure is linked to lower cognition in about half of those studies, and arsenic and manganese are inversely associated with cognition, so potentially related to the decrease in cognition. Again, these are tentative. That means that there are some mixed evidence in the literature about if these are really linked, but it is something in 2015. I'm sure there's been so much more research in the last 10 years on all of this stuff. So keep that in mind when you read scientific literature. There's a lot that can be covered and a lot of advancements that can be done in 10 years. But that kind of leads us to kind of the big picture issue. Do you want to explain more what the big picture issue is?
Sure. The big picture issue in this case is that there's no formal systematic process that exists to classify a chemical as a neurotoxins, unlike carcinogens. Carcinogens? Car- LOL, I told you I cannot English today. I don't know what it is.
English is my first language. It's okay.
It is not my first language. Also, there's a lot of difficult words in this paper, and it kind of throws me off a little bit. I'm not used to like medical words. I'm used to psychological words. So this kind of throws me off my game a little bit. Anyway, it also slows recognition of harmful toxins and delays prevention efforts, despite their significant impact on children's brain development. So even though there is this significant impact on a child's brain development with these toxins, there has not been as much recognition just yet, at least in 2015. I don't know what the current state of that is, if it has been recognized more or not, but back then, these toxins were not recognized and were not decreased in their usage, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think these toxins that we've been talking about, like they're pretty well known. You hear them in the media, you hear them in everyday life. They're pretty common things and common words that are acronyms that are thrown around. And for the big issue is that there are there is a systematic way to label a molecule or a thing, um, as a cancer causing ingredient or thing or molecule. That's not the case as of in 2015. That was not the case for a neurotoxin. There, that same kind of formal um, diagnostic, this is a neurotoxin, was not the same. The labeling process is not the same as it was for carcinogens. And remember, carcinogens is just like cancer causing or potential cancer causing.
That makes sense
So
now.
that's really a big issue because they aren't getting labeled as these neurotoxins that have potential harm, that can cause potential harm for neural development and brain health. And more research, which I'm sure has been done in the last 10 years, but in 2015, significantly more research needs to be done to be able to classify these chemicals and pollutants and really understand the direct impact that it is having on brain health and nervous system health.
It is also adding to that tricky to measure the impact of these neurotoxins. And why is that? It's because most of the research relies on observational studies, making it hard to prove cause and effect. They see something that happens, so they correlate it, can't really prove cause and effect. Many other factors affect brain development, such as nutrition, poverty, or maltreatment, making toxins hard to isolate. Children also vary in how much toxin they absorb and metabolize due to genetics, diet, and behavior, another factor that makes it more difficult. Conditions linked to toxins like IQ deficits and ADHD are common but non-specific, which also complicates research. However, despite these challenges, evidence is linking toxins to brain impact, and that's strong and it's also consistent, which is good.
So, despite us not being able to necessarily fully understand the mechanism of how and why at the very very basic, chemical level, the large scale of saying exposure to this is either increasing the risk or is somehow linked to these cognitive deficits or intellectual disabilities is still strong and consistent, which still goes to show you should probably not be exposed to these during those during like pregnancy, field development, or as young children, or even as an adult. Like some things are coming out. Like it's so crazy to really dive into the literature of like the neurotoxins and the toxins just as an adult and the implications that they have. But we're not going down that route. We're just focusing on this review paper.
It's also interesting because some people think like, oh, but it's just a little bit. Well, no safe level of exposure for some of the toxins. Let's say lead. Lead is the classic example. There is no threshold where exposure is considered safe to lead. Even very low levels are linked to significant IQ loss, about 7 points, and the greatest harm happens at the lowest exposure levels because it is like a slow, gradual exposure that at first you don't notice it, but over time it's really affecting someone's brain development.
Yeah, it's
In
like the
20,
building. It's like the building or like the
yeah,
domino. The accumulation of the exposure is almost, as they're saying in this paper, is actually more harmful than just like one acute dose of a high exposure.
yeah,
It's
because
what
then
we're
at
trying.
least you know I got this one big exposure and you can stay away from it. But if you have an unknown exposure to lead and you live around that toxin day in, day out, gradually over time, it just messes things up. In 2012, the CDC officially declared that there is no safe level of lead exposure. That I don't think has changed over time.
I didn't pull up the CDC, but I do not think it has.
I don't think it has. Um,
However, despite some of taking lead, for example, as Mark just talked about, where we know that there is no safe level of exposure, the dose response is unclear for many toxins, and a lot of it are toxins that just may not have been explored as much, or we just cannot We have not yet reached a point where we can isolate it and say this confirms this level is unsafe. And some of these are PCBs, different organic phosphate or just pesticides in general, and PBNDEs. Um, in theory, and we would assume that there's probably no safe level, showing a linear relationship with harm. Um, but again, we are as of 2015, we're still um, looking at those relationships to kind of confirm that there is no safe level. By now, there probably has been a relationship formed. Again, this was just based on this one paper. And then for mercury related, some mercury related effects may have a threshold, but the research is mixed. So again, there's just either not enough done, or we haven't been able to isolate it, or there's just been some limitations in the research that have caused these kind of mixed conclusions about mercury related effects, and whether or not there is a safe threshold. So again, as of 2015, that was kind of unknown.
So let's add up how a small IQ drop in one kid can add into a big population effect. If you have small IQ drops, let's say 5-point drop in average IQ with a child, this could lead to 57% more children with an IQ less than 70 and fewer with gifted children with an IQ above 130. So even if it's just one kid in your neighborhood, but there's 20 others somewhere else, this could add up. Low level exposures to lead, mercury, and pesticides may have as big as an effect on overall IQ as ADHD or preterm birth. So this shows that these toxins may have a very big effect on someone's intellectual abilities. And with that being said, small exposures add up. Like we said before, it's sometimes worse to have small exposures over time than to have one big exposure at once and that's it, because we probably have underestimated how much these smaller exposures could affect a kid's or children's intellectual abilities.
Yeah. Currently, as of 2015, I shouldn't say currently because we're 10 years post, but in 2015, the typical approach was high risk. Public health usually targets the most exposed children, but most cases of harm occur in kids with the moderate exposure. So they put all their efforts into the highly exposed children, and they kind of neglected and didn't take the risk as seriously with those moderate or that um, accumulation exposure.
Yeah.
Those kids they didn't really take into effect. And this high risk approach is called the preventative paradox, where um, the approach is only protecting high risk kids but fail to protect the majority, because the majority is going to have that low to moderate exposure over accumulation. But the prevention paradox is basically saying that the high risk approach, which is the most common, is not protecting the majority. It's only protecting those considered high risk.
Which we can use lead as an example for that. The CDC uses 5 micrograms. Is that what it's called? That micrograms per deciliter as a reference value for intervention. However, children above that level account for only 18% of IQ points lost from lead. And most of the total harms happen in children with lower but still harmful levels of exposure. So that's, again, that like medium risk group, they say it. But those are also the type of kids that have the more long-term exposure to lower levels, which adds up to worse problems and consequences. So what are some long-term consequences for lead exposure? Children with higher lead exposure may never reach their full cognitive potential as adults. Lead exposure is also linked to a faster cognitive decline and potentially earlier onset of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Few other toxins have been tracked into adulthood, but it's likely their effects also persist for life. Lead's just been one of those things that's been around since forever.
Yeah, and so that we're gonna touch on kind of like three main intellectual disabilities real fast. We'll start with and the effects of toxins on these three different intellectual disabilities, and we'll start with ADHD. So ADHD, as of 2015, affects around 1 in 10 children in the U.S. And of these, children, boys are 2.5 times more likely to be diagnosed. ADHD is generally characterized by hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. And around 50% of the people diagnosed with ADHD actually also have a learning disorder as well. There are some key environmental risk factors, such as exposure to lead, uh, natal tobacco exposure when the fetus is in the womb, and pesticides. And this has been kind of um, seen through brain imaging, so not just questionnaires, like actual brain imaging that show that these toxins alter brain structures that are linked to ADHD. So again, there is some development, and I'm sure in the last 10 years even more. But there's imaging of the brain that is showing some alterations due to these exposures. Other potential toxins that may influence or worsen ADHD is mercury, PBDEs, PCBs, PFCs, air pollutants, plastics, etc. And many of these disrupt dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, and this aligns very well with dopamine deficiency theories that are coinciding with ADHD or the causes of ADHD. So there are some kind of physiological differences now that are changes that we are now seeing through these imagings and hormonal shifts. Furthermore, small toxin related shifts in behavior can double ADHD prevalence, again, just relating to potentially increasing the risk of developing or being born with ADHD. And then regarding blood lead and prenatal tobacco exposure has been shown to have increase the risk by 8 times developing ADHD. So if you are exposed to lead, or if the mother's exposed to lead, and if the if the mother uh, smoked or had tobacco usage while you were in the womb, that fetus or that baby will have an 8 times higher risk of developing ADHD. And then lastly, about 1 in 3 cases as of 2015, which is approximately 1 million US children, may be linked to lead tobacco exposure. So, again, these definitely are showing that they have the potential to increase the risk. We are still trying to figure out exactly mechanistically what is the exact cause, and is there a direct cause and effect, or is it just an increased risk, etc. So again, all of that is still being formulated, and again, in the last 10 years, I'm sure way more research has been done.
Next, we will dive into autism, another neurodevelopmental disorder. This article states that it affects 1 in 68 US children and that it's more common in males than females. However, research shows that autism levels are actually not more common in males than females. All of the diagnostic criteria have just been based on male traits, which is hence why more males are being diagnosed than females. Nowadays, there is more research into females on the spectrum. So hopefully in the next 10 years, there is also diagnostic criteria more formulated for females rather than males. But back in 2015, there were definitely more males diagnosed than females with autism. Environmental factors now seen just as important as genetics when it comes to autism. Some of the risk factors to develop autism are folate status, protective when sufficient. However, folate receptor antibodies higher in parents of autistic children. Then we have the valproic acid. This increases the risk because it blocks the folate. And then we also have airborne pollutants like metals, diesel, PM2.5, and they're all linked.
That's air pollutant.
It's an air pollutant. And they're all linked to ASD, but specific pollutants not consistent across studies. However, key research needs to measure exposure during early pregnancy because this is critical development window. Clearly, there has been more research back in 2015 about ADHD and autism. Maybe nowadays that research has been more similar to each other. But ADHD was already more common back in 2015 than it was with autism.
Yeah, and then the last kind of behavior or learning disability, not only learn, but brain health behavior is antisocial behaviors that this paper touched on. I can't remember what they classified as anti-behavioral kind of characteristics, but anyway, they saw that lead exposure was linked to more impulsivity, hyperactivity, aggression, and later they've also seen links to delinquency and criminality. They first started looking at this in animal studies that showed early lead exposure disrupts the mother-infant interactions and social play. And then in human studies, they looked they concluded that children in the highest lead quintile are 8 times more likely to meet criteria for conduct disorder. All that means is the children exposed to the higher levels or the highest levels of lead are 8 times more likely to meet criteria for conduct disorder.
And conduct disorder is just basically the antisocial personality disorder for children. You can diagnose a child with antisocial personality disorder. So before that, you have conduct disorder. Not everyone who has conduct disorder ends up having also antisocial personality disorder, but it is definitely one of the risk factors to develop antisocial personality disorder. See, I'm much better with the psychological language than the medical language.
So then, they performed 2 cohort studies, and these cohort studies did link childhood lead exposure to higher arrest rates as adults. And so this research kind of suggests that major drop in a potential in certain areas that major drop in violent crimes could be partly due to the declining lead exposure because now we can't paint houses with lead and things like that. So that could be a potential factor, understanding these behaviors and the kind of physiological or personality kind of traits that go along with lead exposure.
This paper also looked at what it cost, all of these toxins, brain-harming toxins. In 2015, it cost the U.S. over $70 billion annually, lead, mercury, and others. It did not include the cost of research to understand chemical toxicity, the cost of cleaning up contaminated communities, but most importantly, as they called the human cost, lost potential, daily challenges for children, and the burdens on parents and society. So that was just a little bit of an extra topic that he included before going to the limitations and confounding.
So I just want to actually clarify that. So he specifies that the another research pair estimated that the 70 million billion cost of exposures of lead, mercury, and toxins that affect intellectual abilities. So it's not like the toxins themselves, but it's the repercussions of our health.
Some of the limitations, I will list them for you. Observational studies cannot prove causation because exposures aren't randomly assigned. Also, many studies do not account for some key confounders, such as home environment and nurturing behavior, breastfeeding, secondhand smoke or other environmental toxins, iron status, and parental mental health. and confounders can inflate or hide true associations. For example, mercury exposure from fish sometimes appears safe because fish also provides beneficial nutrients. Similar challenges exist for pesticides in fruits and vegetables. However, despite these limitations, patterns are clear. Low-level toxins during critical brain development windows have lifelong impacts. Effects of these are especially pronounced at the population level, highlighting the urgent need for prevention.
Yes. And so, winding down this episode, because it's been a long one for us,
It has been.
let's talk about some prevention strategies that this author in this review kind of outlined. So, first, the best strategy: identify and restrict slash ban toxins before they enter the market or environment. That goes back to we need to be able to classify something as neurotoxic, um, so that we are aware and it's treated with the kind of respect that it
Or
prevention
urgency.
urgency that it gives. The current problem: industries can sell products until repeated evidence proves toxicity, and the problem with that is once something is widespread, it's hard to disentangle the effects. And I understand both sides of this. Like, you don't want to prevent something going onto the market if it can improve life. Um, if it's safe, how or delay it because we don't know the research on it. However, for human health and for childhood health and just longevity, maybe we should have a little bit more restrictions on what's actually going out, and actually understand if this is toxic or not, if it's harmful or not, and if it is harmful, in what way is it harmful, etc. So again, that's probably one of the biggest current problems. Again, if we could identify and and label things, if we had a clear criteria, maybe this problem wouldn't be so out of hand. He also mentioned some misconceptions, such that brain-based disorders are often wrongly attributed to mostly being genetic or to parenting problems. However, it is seen that the gene environment association or interplay is probably one of the biggest results or um, causes. And then we have pre-market testing gap, which means that many toxins like lead, plastics, they aren't tested widespread, before widespread exposure. So how do we know that they're safe before? Like, there's no regulation, and that's a big thing. It's like, where's the regulation at? And then he does point out that perhaps education alone is not sufficient. Advertising or advising parents or educating parents helps a little bit. He acknowledges, but meaningful reduction really comes down to just eliminating the source, such that, for example, not painting rooms with lead paint, phasing lead out of gasoline, etc. We've seen, by eliminating the lead, it has helped the most. But the education does kind of go hand in hand. Voluntary actions by companies, basically, are the companies being cognitive? Are they aware of what their chemicals are doing? Are they aware what their formulations are doing? Are they voluntarily removing harmful things from their products? That helps when companies take ownership, but again, limited due to the lack of other chemical replacements for some of these.
We also need a regulatory overhaul, which means you shift burden of proof to industry to show chemicals are non-toxic before marketing, so that also you prove something is good to use before you put it out on the market. This also strengthened EPA standard for environmental chemical, pollutants, and airborne toxins. You could fund a national surveillance system for learning problems and mental disorders, establish independent scientific panels to evaluate evidence linking toxins to brain-based disorder and set safety standards. or form a national task force for a comprehensive prevention strategy, including early childhood education and toxin elimination. These are all suggestions made by the author that are potential tools, ways to combat this issue. However, it's not that simple
I feel like it would
because
be
we're,
kind of hard to start implementation of this. So like, yeah, they can be
yeah,
great in theory, but like the actual implementation of it,
yeah,
we often do see in history, like the independent scientific panel, like that would be amazing. But we have seen in historically, they're often dependent on, or they often make claims or conclusions based on who's giving them money. So they
yeah,
aren't always trusted. Again, historical evidence have shown us that in variety, maybe not in this, but in variety of other things. So again, in theory, these would be great. He is posing some pretty good
yeah.
actions
And I
again,
think some
but
of
in
them
practice, it might
are
not
also
be.
very costly.
Yeah, 100%. So overall, I would say the takeaway is that low-level toxin exposures can still be bad and can cause substantial but often hidden harm. A proactive, systematic approach is very much needed as of 2015, and I would still say even in today's
Yeah,
year of 2025, it's still needed to help protect not only children's developing brain, definitely them because they're most sensitive, but also just adults as well, just like
yeah, just
humans,
humans in
like
general.
just like stop poisoning us. Like, full
Yeah.
stop.
And we know it's been a long episode, and you might not have stayed with us for the entire episode. However, we have linked the journal article that we talked about, so you can read about all of what we talked yourself, and you can answer any questions that you might still have left after this episode. We try to keep it as concise as possible, so we might have missed a couple things here and there, but make sure to read the article if you're interested. So